leader of Iraq's autonomous Kurdish region moves a step closer towards breaking up the country after announcing preparations for an independence referendum. Israeli occupation forces reinforced their positions near the Gaza border following overnight airstrikes which injured 11 people. Iran and the six world powers resume nuclear talks in Vienna, aimed at clinching a final deal by the July 20th deadline. Good evening, Mariam Khaddad with you this hour at Al-Attijah World News. The president of Iraq's semi-autonomous Kurdish region, Masoud Barzani, has called for a secession referendum as the confrontation over disputed territories intensifies between Baghdad and Erbil. The Kurdish region has long been at odds with Iraq's central government over numerous issues, including oil exports, as well as the more recent occupation of the oil-rich city of Kirkuk by Peshmerga forces.
The parliament should make preparations to begin to organize a referendum on the right of self-determination. It will strengthen our position and will be a powerful weapon in our hands. There's nothing left but for the residents of these regions to decide on self-determination. And for those who say they will return to these regions, I say they're mistaken, because the Peshmerga will not withdraw from them under any circumstances.
Amid the brutal conflict against extremist groups in Iraq, a new confrontation on the redrawing of borders is brewing. The semi-autonomous Kurdistan region is forging ahead with its plan for full independence at the expense of war-ridden Iraq. Kurdish leader Masoud Barzani has called on the regional parliament to establish an independent election commission to oversee a secession referendum and to set a date for the vote. Barzani also warned that his army will remain in disputed territories. Our forces have been deployed to all the disputed regions and areas. The Peshmerga will not withdraw from Kirkuk and other areas under our control. There are countries that are supporting us, and we will not oppose their support. The support Barzani was referring to came from Israeli President Shimon Peres earlier this week, who likened the Kurdish move to that of the Palestinian territories' occupation. Nonetheless, highly optimistic about the prospect of realizing their dream of an independent state exclusively for the Kurds, hundreds of people voiced their support in front of the parliament.
We've come from Ahmadiyya to show our support and backing to al-Barzani's announcement of a Kurdish state. We will support him with our souls and money, as staying with Baghdad has become almost impossible, because once they are with us and the next time they turn against us.
Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki had previously dismissed the Kurdish call for independence.
No one has the right to exploit the events that took place to impose a fait accompli, as happened in some of the actions of the Kurdistan region. This is rejected.
Faced with the prospect of sectarian strife along with fighting terrorism, Iraqis will now have to contend with another conflict, pitting the Kurds against the Arabs.
Let's get some more perspective on this with political analyst Mudar Al-Khairallah, who joins me now via Skype from London. With these preparations for an independence referendum, are the Kurds the only winners in the security crisis gripping Iraq?
Thank you for inviting me on the show. I don't think there's going to be any winner as far as Iraq is concerned. The Kurds have to realize that they've had an alliance with the central government in Baghdad. We've had the president of Iraq as a Kurd. We've had the foreign minister as a Kurd. The natural resources of the whole of Iraq should be shared between all the people of Iraq. So I don't think anybody's going to be a winner in this state. And what's happened now is that Masoud Barzani has pushed the Peshmerga to increase the land controlled by them by up to 40% since the ISIL declared their Islamic State. They have autonomy, they have self-determination already, and even if they want to hold a referendum, there are ethical ways of doing so rather than exploiting the dire situation Iraq faces at the moment.
Well, do you believe that the Kurds allowed Islamic State militants to seize Mosul, as some have suggested?
It's still speculation, of course, but there is a strong argument that supports this speculation and conspiracy. There was only a few thousand, if not hundreds, of ISIL fighters that entered a large area and a number of provinces within North Iraq, and populations more than 3 million just fell within 2 hours of entering Iraq. So there must have been disloyalty, there must have been problems within the army itself, and deserters within the army as part of a bigger ploy and a bigger conspiracy. The thing that one doesn't understand either, that if these fighters are coming to take over land in Iraq, why are they not putting a fight at the borders with the Peshmerga of Kurdistan and focusing their attentions on central Baghdad and areas where the Shia reside? So there are lots of players, big players in the geopolitical area within the Middle East, and I think that there is a strong argument that this wasn't just a straightforward Islamic State militants seizing Mosul and other parts of Iraq, but there has been a conspiracy.
Well, let's discuss that a little bit more. Why have the Israelis pledged such open support for the KRG's secession from Iraq? What's in it for Tel Aviv?
I think it is known to the world that Israel has hostile relationship with Iran and other players in the Middle East. Many countries in the Middle East don't recognize the state of Israel to this day. They completely are against all the atrocities committed against the people of Palestine, etc., and that would include a place like Iran. To have the incentives are clear to have a sensitive and strategic alliance in Kurdistan next door to Iran will give them great access in keeping an eye on what's happening in Iran on the political arena and the military arena. And also Kurdistan has many natural resources. Masoud Barzan has extended the Peshmerga to go into Kirkuk, which of course, as you know, is oil rich. So they would have full access and commercial deals to gain many natural resources from Iraq.
And how much of a destabilizing move would an independent Kurdistan be for the region, especially Turkey and Iran?
I think that would be huge. It would be the absolute disaster as far as Iran and Turkey is concerned. They have significant Kurdish population in Iran and Turkey. Kurdistan has already got some influence and control in northeast Syria, where the Syrian army have withdrawn. I think it will destabilize the autonomy of Iran and Turkey if Kurdistan becomes an independent nation. I'm not saying that they don't have the right for self-determination or to have autonomy, but this should be done through a referendum that is agreed by all parties involved.
So what can Baghdad do to stop this, especially considering the fact that Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki has his hands full at the moment?
I think it's difficult for the central government in Baghdad, and I think Nouri al-Maliki has faced many problems in trying to stabilize rule in Iraq. Masoud Barzani and in Kurdistan has, in the past, history is declared, and we see clearly when he utilized Saddam's ruthless army against fellow Kurds to try and win some support and win some stability and leadership in Kurdistan. Unfortunately, we see many political figures within Iraq who look at their self-interest first before the interest of the whole nation. I think the only thing that Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki and the people who are loyal to the unity of Iraq can do is be patient, be united as much as they can in the fight against ISIL. And once that fight is over, hopefully now the world is unanimous and united on the threat of ISIL, then we can turn around and we can turn our heads towards Kurdistan. We can support their autonomy. We can support a referendum through the appropriate channels, but we would not allow their extension to the 40% of land that they've just gained without contesting it.
All right, political analyst Mr. Mudar al-Khairallah, thank you very much for weighing in on that.
Thank you.
And staying with Iraq now, where 32 Turkish truck drivers who were held hostage in the country for 3 weeks by Islamic State militants have been freed and handed over to Turkish consular staff. Turkey's foreign minister confirmed the release, but did not mention the 49 Turks who were kidnapped last month when the militants stormed the Turkish consulate in Mosul.
As a result of efforts and daily consultations for the past 23 days, now I am happy to say that our 32 drivers have been received by our Consulate General, and now our Consulate General is on the way to Erbil with the drivers.
Meanwhile, heavy clashes between the Iraqi army and Islamic State militants were reported in eastern Tikrit as Iraqi security forces continued to make major advances against the extremist group. Southeast of Tikrit in the country's Diyala province, Iraqi troops launched operations in Baquba in a bid to cleanse the area of armed militants. Our correspondent Rihab al-Rikabi gives us a look now at the ongoing battle for northwestern Iraq.
3 weeks passed when extremist militants linked to Al-Qaeda offshoot the Islamic State swept into the northern Iraqi city of Mosul in Nineveh province and seized a number of key cities and small towns in western and northwestern Iraq. There, Human Rights Watch reported that the extremist militants routinely carry out beheadings, mass executions and killings against the Iraqi army members and minority populations, mainly Turkmen, Shiite Muslims, Christians and Shabaks, as well as sexual harassment against women and destruction of religious properties in their bid to enforce what they called the Islamic law and to ignite a broad sectarian war in the country. Meanwhile, Iraqi troops with the pro-government militias and hundreds of thousands of volunteers who responded to call to arms by Iraq's most senior Shia cleric, Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, who have been reinforced by helicopter gunships and fighter jets, launched day-long counter-offensives on militant targets to claw back militant-held territories. Iraqi armed forces have been engaged in heavy fighting with the militants in different fronts, in Tikrit in Salahuddin province, in western Baquba in Diyala province, and Fallujah in Iraq's western Anbar, and have so far been able to push back militants in several areas. Major casualties have been recorded on both sides.
Samarra Operation Command continues with its counter-offensives against the militants, and the armed forces, with the coordination with the Air Force, are making significant advances in Tikrit as the entire city will be completely cleared of the militants. Elsewhere in Iraq, particularly in Diyala province, the armed forces have been able so far to dislodge the militants from 6 towns in Shirwin, and the Iraqi Air Force has been heavily deployed to secure the capital Baghdad and its outskirts.
Moreover, official sources have reported that Iraqi army continued to make major advances in the city of Tikrit in a clearance operation aimed to dislodge militants from the city.
Tikrit University is now under the full control of the Iraqi army, and the armed forces are continuing with their offensive against the militants in the city of Tikrit. Iraqi armed forces could secure the Spiker military base and are willing to drive the militants out of the city.
Furthermore, Iraqi government has intensified security measures in the Baghdad's outskirts after the main road between the capital Baghdad and the holy city of Samarra, where the holy shrines of Al-Askari Imams are located, has been cleared of militants. Around 1.2 million people have been displaced within Iraq by unrest this year, including hundreds of thousands who fled their homes following the militant offensive, taking refuge in Iraqi Kurdistan. Others have been forced to stay in camps near Al-Khazar checkpoint, the main entry route from Arab areas of northern Iraq to Erbil. And according to the United Nations official casualty figures for June, 2,417 people were killed and 2,287 more were wounded. And according to the official figures, 244 were killed and 588 wounded in Fallujah. These figures do not include militants. Rihab al-Rikabi, Al-Ittijah, Baghdad.
Let's speak to our other correspondent in Iraq, Mustafa Kattan, now for more details on the ground. Mustafa, what is the latest coming out of the Salahuddin province? Is the Iraqi army any closer to retaking the city of Tikrit?
Yes, actually, the Iraqi army, with the support of the Iraqi volunteers and the Iraqi Air Force, continue waging against the militants to kick them out of the city of Tikrit and Salahuddin province. the Iraqi army now approaching to empty the city of Tikrit from any militant existence in the city of Tikrit. And actually today fierce clashes occurred between the Iraqi army and the militants spearheaded by the so-called IS group in the city of Tikrit. So in Diyala, the Iraqi army today keep fighting and battling the militants in the Diyala province, especially in Ba'quba city and in Al-Mansurati Jabal city, and also in Shirwin city in the north of the province. Today, new enforcements reached the city of Samarra and Tel Afar to support the Iraqi army. Of course, enforcement from the volunteers who want to participate and who want to be integrated to fight alongside with the Iraqi army in the northern and in the west of the country. So the Iraqi army, according to officers and according to security experts and security officials, they said that the Iraqi army is preparing to launch a wide range and a huge offensive to retake the city of Mosul. Today in Mosul, actually, the militants there, militants believed to be linked to the so-called the Islamic State. They committed some atrocities and some crimes when they killed two clerics who denied to support their ideas and their concepts, especially about something belongs to slave sex and about other really extreme concepts. Also in Baghdad today, especially at the hours of today, a suicide bomber blew himself up in a Shiite mosque in the district of Al-Jihad in the south of Baghdad. And the attack actually killed and injured more than 18 civilians. Yes.
All right, Mustafa Kattan, our correspondent in Iraq, thanks a lot for those updates. Well, in what the UN says amounts to war crimes, militants from the Al-Qaeda offshoot of the Islamic State are recruiting children as young as 10 years old to fight against the Iraqi army. While there are young children who voluntarily join IS, there are many more that are being forced to enlist with the extremist group.
Within days of the Al-Qaeda offshoot of the Islamic State's onslaught in Iraq, photographs of militants riding armed vehicles on the streets of Mosul emerged as swaths of territory fell into their hands. But amid the heartbreak of violence is the story of Iraq's forgotten children, many of whom have reportedly been forced to take up arms and fight alongside the so-called Islamic State. One such volunteer is 10-year-old Abdullah. His brother and father, the report claims, were senior members of the Islamic State and were killed fighting Iraqi forces last year. But that hasn't diminished Abdullah's enthusiasm to fight after years of carrying a gun often twice his size. Children are held the same standards as everyone else when being recruited. The Islamic State has two rules: obedience to the IS leader even at the cost of the volunteer's life, and personal recommendation from another member of the IS.
من عيلة الأسد أو على دين الأسد نحبه؟ لا. طب نعمل فيه إيه؟ ضحوا. ليه؟ لأنه كافر. لأنه إيه؟ لأنه كافر. فما سوى الإسلام كافر. أوباما مسلم ولا كافر؟ كافر. رئيس روسيا؟ رئيس الصين؟
This gets them through the door of the world of weapons and physical training, and religious lessons in accordance with the Salafist doctrine. In a report published in June, Human Rights Watch revealed that in both Iraq and Syria, the Islamic State specifically recruited children through free schooling campaigns that included weapons training and have given them dangerous tasks, including suicide bombing missions.
أمنيتي عندما أكبر أصبح مجاهد أقاتل الطواغيت والذين يحكمون بغير ما أنزل الله. الله مولانا ولا مولى لهم.
In its annual report issued mid-May, the UN also said that children fighting within the Islamic State are reportedly paid at the same rate as adults, approximately $200 a month, and undergo both weapons and ideological training.
Syrian army units retook the industrial city district north of Aleppo amid a massive militant retreat across the region. The advances have cleared the way for Syrian troops to retake most of the city's outposts as search and destroy operations continue to clear the contested areas. Meanwhile, the Britain-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights has reported that Islamic State militants have seized control of a major oil field on the Iraqi border in Syria's Deir ez-Zor province. Meanwhile, in video footage posted online, several tribes and foreign-backed militant groups active in Deir ez-Zor pledged their allegiance to the so-called Islamic State militants, as reports surfaced of a massive al-Nusra Front retreat.
We announce that we seek God's forgiveness and will refrain from supporting the military groups that are fighting the Islamic State. We also announce our dissent from all rebel and military councils and from the coalition. We pledge our allegiance to the Islamic State and to the Caliph Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, noting that we are not responsible for any persons who disrupt this agreement and will reprimand such persons if possible.
A 19-year-old woman in the U.S. has been arrested for allegedly trying to provide support to Islamic State militants. Identified as Shannon Maureen Conley from the U.S. city of Denver, the 19-year-old had attended a military tactics and firearms course with the U.S. Army earlier this year. She was allegedly planning to use the training to help the IS militants through a man she met online. While the United States and Britain have sounded the alarm after Western intelligence agencies alleged that al-Qaeda affiliates in Yemen and Syria were working to construct a bomb which cannot be detected by airport security. The revelations have led to calls for increased security measures in airports in both the U.S. and Britain.
It's the Homeland Security's biggest threat. Explosive devices can be hidden in bags, shoes, or even toothpaste. However, the presence of heavy security, X-ray scanners, and metal detectors have prevented major terrorist operations from being staged. But what if extremist groups get their hands on non-metallic explosives that could pass right through these high-tech machines? New revelations by intelligence agencies have revealed that al-Qaeda is working on just that. According to American intelligence, there are indications that bomb makers from al-Qaeda's Yemen and Syria affiliates joined forces to perfect an explosive device that could foil airport security. Officials are now concerned that bombs made with non-metallic explosives could be surgically implanted in extremists' bodies. On Wednesday, Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson said he directed the Transportation Security Administration to put more security measures in place after sharing recent and relevant information with foreign allies. The UK Department for Transport also confirmed Wednesday that it is stepping up some of its aviation security measures as well. The measures may include closer scrutiny of personal electronics and footwear, but government officials would not reveal any specifics. It is now becoming increasingly evident that extremists traveling to war-torn Syria and Iraq pose a threat to Western nations, largely due to their ability to return to their countries without visas on European passports.
Israeli warplanes launched a series of fresh airstrikes on the Gaza Strip, injuring at least 11 people and provoking retaliation from the Palestinian side against Israeli settlements. The latest escalation comes as Zionist troops deployed near the border with Gaza. Our correspondent Belsam El-Atrash has that story.
At least 17 Palestinians were injured in the early hours of Thursday morning after Israeli air raids targeted training sites belonging to resistance factions and open areas in the northern and southern parts of the Gaza Strip. 10 residents were hospitalized following a series of multiple airstrikes, including a 17-year-old boy who sustained shrapnel wounds near Gaza City.
The escalation led to the injury of around 10 Palestinian citizens, 7 from North Gaza Strip, including a pregnant young woman who is in a critical situation. After the strikes that hit Safina area, 3 Palestinians were wounded as well, raising the count of injuries among Palestinians since the kidnapping of the 3 settlers in Al Khalil to 5 martyrs and 31 injuries.
Palestinian resistance group Hamas retaliated by firing dozens of rockets on Israeli settlements in Sderot. The strikes caused material damage and injured 11 settlers. Hamas had previously vowed to respond firmly if the Israelis did not put an end to their ongoing aggression. The Israelis responded by deploying troops towards the Gazan border. Buses with soldiers as well as military vehicles were seen taking up position in nearby areas, a move seen by many as a prelude to further escalation.
We tell this Zionist enemy that the resistance factions are prepared for them. This enemy knows that we will get them and we will not hesitate to reply to any aggression. We all resistance factions, Al-Mujahideen brigades, Al-Qassam brigades, Sarai al-Quds brigades and the Nasser brigades are all united to strike the Zionist enemy wherever they may be.
Egyptian sources have confirmed that the Gaza Strip may be forced to endure an unprecedented level of Israeli aggression, which may begin within hours. Hamas, for its part, stressed that it is not interested in any new confrontation with the Israelis, but if the need arises, the movement is ready.
The occupation threats do not scare us. We are ready and able to defend the Palestinian people. We warn the occupation to not continue its nonsense and confirm that we will stand up and Gaza will not be a walk in the park for the occupation forces. Gaza will not surrender. The Zionist enemy cannot get away with attacking Gaza without paying a price.
Meanwhile, in the West Bank, Zionist troops pressed on with their raid campaign. Israeli soldiers ransacked houses and detained dozens of Palestinians. Rubber bullets and tear gas canisters were later used against angry residents. The latest Israeli escalation has reignited talks of a possible intifada. The brutal crackdown in occupied territories is viewed as a reminiscence of recorded provocation that have left Palestinians with no option but to respond with all means at their disposal. Israeli acts of aggression against Palestinians have escalated in recent days, at a time when Israelis have failed to decide on whether to expand their military operations in the Gaza Strip, leaving many to interpret the move that the Zionists are deeply concerned with what the Palestinian resistance faction's response will be. Balsam Al-Atrash, Al-Ittijah TV, Gaza.
You're watching Al-Ittijah World News. Coming up after the break. Violence marks the one-year anniversary of the ouster of Egypt's Islamist president, Mohamed Morsi. Welcome back. Here's a reminder of the top stories we're following for you this hour. The leader of Iraq's autonomous Kurdish region moves a step closer towards breaking up the country. after announcing preparations for an independence referendum. Israeli occupation forces reinforced their positions near the Gaza border following overnight airstrikes, which injured 11 people. And Iran and the six world powers resume nuclear talks in Vienna, aimed at clinching a final deal by the July 20th deadline. With less than 3 weeks to go before a July 20th deadline expires, Iran and the P5+1 group of countries resumed talks over Tehran's nuclear program in a bid to hammer out a permanent accord that would end a decade-long dispute between the Islamic Republic and the West.
The doors of diplomacy are wide open, it seems, to receive Iran's bid to disprove concerns over its nuclear program. The sixth and final round of nuclear talks between representatives from the Islamic Republic and six world powers opened in Vienna, where the two sides are looking to hammer out a permanent accord that would please both sides. Yet, a win-win scenario remains uncertain, with the P5+1 group of nations and Iran still trying to bridge gaps, mainly differences over the timetable for the lifting of Western-imposed sanctions against the Islamic Republic and the scale to which Tehran will continue uranium enrichment. As per usual, the Iranian delegation was led by Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, while the six world powers were headed by EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton. The two camps, although for different purposes, are both aiming high.
The purpose of these negotiations is to get those assurances and those proofs down in black and white on paper in a good agreement that everybody is happy with. So that is what we're here to do. As I say, the E3+3 will work with determination under the leadership of Catherine Ashton to achieve that.
Reaching a long-lasting agreement would mean that the West would remove the heavy load of sanctions forced on Iran in exchange for Tehran's consent to reduce uranium enrichment levels. While the Islamic Republic is sure to keep its end of the bargain, there is skepticism over the West's credibility on the political front. But even if a deal is not reached before the interim agreement reached last November expires on July 20th, it won't be the end of the world, given the possibility of a 6-month extension period.
Supporters of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood held rallies dubbed the Day of Anger across the country to mark the first anniversary of the ouster of Islamist President Mohamed Morsi. Our correspondent in Cairo reports now on today's events, which were marred by violence, leaving at least one person dead and several others injured.
Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood has called for nationwide protests to mark the first anniversary of the ouster of Islamist President Mohamed Morsi, dubbed the Day of Anger by the group. Morsi, who was the country's first democratically elected leader, was removed from his post on July 3, 2013, on the orders of then Defense Minister Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, backed by nationwide protests against the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood. And while the authorities in Cairo refer to Morsi's ouster as the People's Revolution, the Muslim Brotherhood regards it as a military coup.
The Muslim Brotherhood's calls for protests is not going to be a big deal, since they're not that powerful nor popular on the ground anymore.
Everyone has the right to protest, as long as it doesn't threaten the national security. Egypt needs work, not protests. Only stability would help the country get back on track.
Egypt's anti-coup alliance has announced that the so-called Day of Anger is only the first leg of a great event which is aimed at reforming the country. But such statements may be slightly premature, although Muslim Brotherhood supporters did turn out for rallies in a number of Egyptian cities, including Cairo and Alexandria. The number of protesters were relatively low, according to the local media reports. Violent clashes between the protesters and the country's security forces, meanwhile, resulted in at least one Muslim Brotherhood supporter being killed and an unknown number injured. Egyptian authorities have stepped up their crackdown against the now outlawed Muslim Brotherhood after 3 explosions struck near the Ittihadiyya presidential palace in Cairo earlier this week. 2 policemen were killed in the attack on Monday, and a number of leaders of the pro-Morsi anti-coup alliance were subsequently arrested. Most Egyptians have so far shown little sympathy for the Islamists.
All of the terrorist organizations adopt the same beliefs and strategies. They all share the same ideology and you cannot really separate them. Their sole purpose is to weaken the Arab world.
For the time being, at least, it seems that the Egyptian street is largely opposed to any brotherhood return to political life, and today's day of rage looks unlikely to mobilize the masses. 1 year has passed since the ouster of Islamist President Mohamed Morsi, yet the unrest in Egypt continues, as several attacks on civilians and army personnel have took place, and as many terrorist organizations in Egypt have pledged their support to ISIS, Egyptians are hoping for an administration crackdown on these terrorist organizations. Reporting for Litiga TV from Cairo, Karim Azzuddin.
Kuwaiti police fired tear gas and stun grenades to disperse protesters demanding the release of a prominent opposition leader. Thousands of people gathered at the residence of former MP Mosallam al-Barak before marching on the nearby jail where the former opposition leader was detained. Kuwait's public prosecutor ordered Barak to be held for 10 days for allegedly insulting the judiciary. A Somali lawmaker and his bodyguard have been shot dead by the Al-Qaeda-linked Al-Shabaab group in the capital, Mogadishu. Gunmen in a car opened fire on the lawmakers as they were leaving a hotel in the capital's port district. The Al-Shabaab group said this was a targeted assassination and that they will continue to attack other MPs if they do not leave the country's parliament. Taliban militants fired rockets into Kabul International Airport, which set a hangar ablaze, but resulted in no casualties. The rockets landed on the military side of the airport, which included a large NATO base, as well as a separate terminal for civilian flights. The Libyan government has regained control of 2 oil terminals from rebels in the east. After reclaiming the terminals, which handle nearly half of the country's oil exports, Tripoli announced that Libya's oil crisis was over.
In what may be the end of Libya's oil crisis, Tripoli has regained control of 2 oil terminals that have been blocked by rebels for 1 year. Libyan Prime Minister Abdallah Thani announced that the 2 oil ports in Ras Lanuf and Al-Sidra in the country's east had been reopened. Together, these 2 ports have the capacity to produce over 500,000 barrels per day. Libya's economy suffered a heavy blow after rebels blockaded export terminals last summer. Eastern rebels seized 4 oil terminals in July in their bid to seek autonomy, slashing output from 1.5 million barrels per day to just 200,000. The lifting of the closure is seen as a sign of goodwill toward the new parliament which was elected last week. The reopening of these 2 terminals, which handle nearly half of the country's normal oil exports, will provide some relief for international oil markets, rattled by fears of disruptions coming from the Iraq crisis.
The Ukrainian parliament has approved the president's nomination for a new defense minister, making him the point man in the battle against rebels in the east of the country. Petro Poroshenko's new appointment is part of a move by the Ukrainian president to shake up the military and rid it of corruption.
Ukrainian army needs a new commander, a soldier who was not just taught how to fight, but who fought himself, a general who knows from experience what a hybrid war is and how to win that war.
I promise you to ensure calm and order in our state, restore territorial integrity and sovereignty of our state, bring back calm and peace to our home. I am sure Ukraine will win, and believe me, a parade of victory will be held in Ukrainian Sevastopol of Crimea. Glory to Ukraine.
Meanwhile, at least 9 civilians were killed in the eastern Ukrainian region of Luhansk. According to pro-Russian activists, the village was attacked by the Ukrainian military on Wednesday. A video posted on a social media website purports to show black smoke and fire rising over destroyed houses in the village. Fighting in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions has spiked after a 10-day ceasefire expired on Monday, and Kiev rejected a further extension. In a bid to ease tensions in the Korean peninsula, Chinese President Xi Jinping headed to Seoul for talks with his South Korean counterpart. This as Japan eased some sanctions against North Korea.
Chinese President Xi Jinping is on his first visit to the Korean peninsula for talks with his South Korean counterpart in a bid to ease tensions in the region, as well as discuss bilateral and regional issues. Both heads of state issued a joint call for the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula.
Realizing denuclearization and maintaining peace and stability on the peninsula are in line with the common interests of 6 party talks members. Relevant sides should resolve the issue through dialogue and consultation.
Under the circumstances where North Korea recently launched missiles again while not dropping its nuclear threats, President Xi's visit to South Korea is a clear message for North Korea's denuclearization, as well as for peace and safety on the Korean peninsula.
China and South Korea also signed 8 joint documents pledging deeper cooperation in a push for a free trade deal. Meanwhile, in a rare concession to North Korea, Japan announced it will lift some sanctions on the isolated state.
Under the principle of action being repaid by action, I want to lift part of the sanctions Japan has imposed. However, this is just the start.
China welcomed the announcement, expressing hopes that Japanese-North Korean ties can improve.
We have noticed through routine consultation the progress that has been made. We hope Japan and North Korea can improve their relations through consultation that can be beneficial to maintaining regional peace and stability.
But not everyone was happy with that announcement.
Also, Japan-North Korea discussions, including those on removing sanctions, must be carried out transparently, and any action taken by the Japanese government related to this must be within limits that do not compromise the framework of international cooperation on the North Korean nuclear and missile issues, such as between South Korea, the United States, and Japan.
Seoul had been hoping that Thursday's joint statement would include a strongly worded warning to North Korea. But analysts had forecast that Beijing was unlikely to step up its rhetoric against its ally in Pyongyang. Beijing has repeatedly pushed for a resumption of the long-stalled 6-party talks involving the 2 Koreas, China, the United States, Japan, and Russia. But Seoul and Washington insist that Pyongyang must first make a tangible commitment to abandoning its nuclear weapons program.
Chinese authorities have enforced a fasting ban in schools and government offices during the Islamic holy month of Ramadan in the rest of Xinjiang region. The ban, though unpopular among the Muslim-majority population in the region, was imposed following a series of deadly attacks by extremist militants. According to officials, the ban is also aimed at protecting students and preventing government offices from promoting religion in the communist country. Fasting in the holy month of Ramadan serves many purposes, including learning to sympathize with the less fortunate. In Yemen, charities are turning this principle into action as they try to feed as many poor families as possible throughout the 30 days of fasting.
Abstaining from food and water for a long period of time throughout the day is a once-in-a-year thing for most Muslims. But for the less fortunate, poverty has forced them to take a habit out of fasting. In the spirit of the holy month of Ramadan, a charity organization in Yemen, Sana'a, has been providing nutritious meals for poverty-stricken families for 23 years, and Project Iftar is continuing to expand.
Throughout the 23 years since 1991, we began our charity project as a small one, just providing food to only 100 families. But today we provide about 400 to 500 families with daily iftar meals.
The meal gathering at the mosque is for anyone who can come, whether they are travelers passing by or the local poor. All can make use of this service.
In the shadow of what seems like never-ending political turmoil in the country, Yemenis have suffered from severe impoverishment. Yemen is standing on the brink of humanitarian crisis.
We face the difficulty of the poor increasing. Poverty and suffering is exacerbated by the security situation and the political and economic conditions that we live in. This requires us to redouble our efforts.
Aid agencies estimate that half of Yemen's population of 24 million are malnourished, and 1 in 2 children suffer from malnutrition. Now, this act of benevolence will most definitely help families that can't afford enough food to get through the month in one of the Arab world's poorest nations.
International aid agencies have warned that some 4 million people in South Sudan are likely to face critical food shortages next month unless massive funding for food aid is provided in what has been described as one of the worst famines ever.
The risk of an all-out famine in the landlocked country of South Sudan is growing with every dawn as the United Nations is building momentum to save the world's youngest country from slipping into a famine that threatens the lives of millions. The United Nations has around 40% of the cash it needs, with a shortfall of over $1 billion. According to the UN's definition, famine implies that at least 20% of households face extreme food shortages, with an acute malnutrition in over 30% of people, and 2 deaths per 10,000 people every day. This famine is the result of the ongoing fighting between forces of President Salva Kiir and troops loyal to rebel leader Riek Machar. Kiir and Machar committed themselves last month to a 3rd ceasefire deal and agreed to forge a transitional government within 60 days. But fighting has continued nevertheless. The continued rise in the number of people fleeing violence offers a clear indication that conditions continue to worsen in the impoverished nation, with over 100,000 civilians crammed inside squalid camps across the country, and the numbers are continuing to rise. The conflict in the world's youngest and one of the poorest countries has killed thousands and forced more than 1.5 million to flee their homes since the war broke out in mid-December. Last month, South Sudan, which gained independence from Sudan in 2011, topped the list of fragile states. And if fighting continues or no immediate aid is provided, experts say that the world is looking at the worst famine in a century.
You've tuned in to Al World News with me, Mariam Khattar. Let's recap our headlines. The leader of Iraq's autonomous Kurdish region moves a step closer towards breaking up the country after announcing preparations for an independence referendum. Israeli occupation forces reinforced their positions near the Gaza border following overnight airstrikes which injured 11 people. And Iran and the 6 world powers resume nuclear talks in Vienna, aimed at clinching a final deal by the July 20th deadline. Well, that's all for this bulletin. Have a good night.